This video is for commentary and analysis under fair use. The views expressed are my own, based on publicly available information and my interpretation of it. At first, it sounds like analysis, but if you listen closely, something else is happening. In the first part, we looked at how a perception gets built. Not just what was said, but how different layers, language, structure, and framing start to guide how everything is interpreted. And once that kind of image is established, everything that follows gets filtered through it. So in this part, I want to slow that process down and look at how one of those layers actually works in real time. From there, the video shifts into what he calls risk factors, a clinical sounding term for behavioral patterns commonly associated with escalation. Repetition, fixation, intensity, boundary violations. Once that framework is introduced, it starts to organize everything that follows. Actions are no longer presented as isolated incidents. They're filtered through that lens, even when her name isn't explicitly repeated. The script stops simply describing events and starts categorizing them as recognizable warning signs, the kinds of patterns often associated with escalation. That shift changes how each moment is interpreted. At the same time, the story is structured as a clear, escalating timeline. And once that framework is in place, this is what it starts to sound like.
So you have this obsessive behavior that increases risk. You have this inordinate amount of anger and rage towards you that suggests that there's a sadistic quality, that this is someone taking pleasure in harming you, taking pleasure in hurting you, taking pleasure in trying to ruin your character and your reputation and your livelihood and your life, right? That's a risk factor. Anyone who has sadistic qualities is going to be a higher risk. Another risk factor here is this very oppositional, let's call it antisocial quality.
And this is where the structure becomes clearer. Initial contact, request to stop, continued behavior, escalation, and finally, legal action. It is the difference between hearing, this happened and then this happened, versus at first it was small, then it kept happening, then it got worse, and eventually it became unavoidable. The second version creates direction. It transforms separate moments into a single, continuous trajectory. And when you layer formal risk factor language on top of that chronological buildup, the events stop feeling like a messy personal conflict. They start to feel like a predictable progression, moving toward a dangerous outcome. That combination is what makes this section so effective, because it does two things at once. The risk factor language gives the story intellectual weight and clinical credibility. The timeline gives it emotional momentum. Together, they create a strong sense of inevitability, as if the final confrontation was the only possible outcome. You're no longer just learning what happened. You're being guided to see a pattern with direction. The next step is to define exactly what that behavior is. So from there, the video pivots into definitions. As these definitions build, they begin to narrow the interpretation. You hear clinical sounding terms like fixated, obsessed, unwanted, repeated. Then it expands into broader categories: surveillance, intimidation, interference, and eventually the legal criteria for cyberstalking, generally defined as repeated, unwanted contact that causes substantial emotional distress. And importantly, these definitions aren't presented in isolation. They are applied directly and specifically to Christina's behavior. And that carries additional weight because John presents himself as a forensic psychologist, someone positioned as having expertise in exactly these kinds of behavioral assessments. So the information doesn't just feel informative, it feels authoritative. As the definitions stack, multiple sources, multiple frameworks, clinical language combined with legal standards, they begin reinforcing one another. Instead of opening up multiple interpretations, they all point in the same direction. What starts as "this happened" gradually becomes "this fits established definitions of stalking and cyberstalking." That shift is powerful because once behavior is mapped into recognizable definitions delivered through expert language, it stops feeling like interpretation. It starts to feel like confirmation. And that framing moves the audience from "I'm hearing a story" to "this has been clinically and legally categorized." Once something is understood that way, the response to it starts to feel inevitable. Running through all of this is a consistent interpretation of motive. The idea that Christina's behavior is fundamentally driven by a desire for control. He doesn't always use the exact word control in every sentence, but the framing is clear and persistent. Her actions are no longer portrayed as repetitive, emotional, or misguided. They're presented as purposeful, directed, and strategic. Deliberate attempts to influence or regain power over the situation. Once motive is introduced like that, it reshapes how everything is interpreted. The difference is striking. If someone says he kept reaching out, for instance, you might think, okay, that's annoying or maybe desperate. But if it's framed as he kept reaching out because he's trying to control the situation, you hear something very different. It feels deliberate. It feels threatening. That small shift in wording completely changes how the behavior is understood. It adds intent. It turns something reactive into something that feels calculated. And once behavior is understood as intentional, it becomes much harder to see it any other way. So now, every earlier example, the repeated contact, the fixation, the boundary violations, gets filtered through that same lens. And you start thinking, this is what she's trying to do. That's the point where interpretation becomes conclusion. This layer is especially effective because it sounds analytical and objective, but it quietly guides you toward a very specific understanding that the behavior isn't just problematic, it's framed as manipulative and power oriented. By the end of this section, you're no longer seeing someone who crossed a line. You're seeing someone whose core motivation is control. And once that idea is in place, the response to it starts to feel justified. And then from there, the framing expands even further. The framing moves beyond individual behavior. After focusing on actions, risk factors, and definitions, the lens shifts to something broader: conformity, belonging, and deviation from expected norms. This is where the interpretation moves from the individual to the system. This isn't labeled explicitly as ideology, but the underlying pattern is clear. Behavior is no longer evaluated just on its own terms. It is being measured against an unspoken standard of what's considered acceptable. So the question changes. It is no longer just what did she do? It becomes how does she deviate from what's considered normal here? And once that conformity lens is in place, the entire narrative shifts again. Specific actions are no longer just events. They're measured against a broader social framework. In this section, that standard is consistently applied to Christina. So her actions don't just appear inappropriate. They appear as a form of unacceptable deviation. So when you step back and look at the full sequence, you can see how each layer builds on the one before it. The shift in perception, then the psychological framing, then the moral lens, then risk, then definition, then motive, and finally, conformity. Each step adds weight, each step narrows interpretation. And by the end, what started as a situation feels like a conclusion. But that's what makes this worth paying attention to, because none of these concepts is inherently wrong. They're real ideas, they're used in real analysis. The question is how they're being applied and what direction they're guiding you in. So when you're watching something like this, it's not just about what's being said, it is about how each piece connects and where it is leading you. And once you can see that structure, you start to experience the entire video differently. So that's what stood out to me while breaking down this hour of the video. The way the story is layered, step by step, until a very specific picture starts to take shape. And once you see that structure, you don't watch a video the same way anymore. If you found this helpful, feel free to like the video or share it with someone who'd want to look at it this way. And if you want more breakdowns like this, you can subscribe. I'd be really curious what stood out to you. Was there a moment or a technique that shifted how you saw things? I read all the comments and I always appreciate the perspective you bring in. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.